Tonight, at Thomas Sankara International Airport in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, something was about to shatter the illusion of diplomatic immunity. A routine shipment carrying what was listed as official documents from a foreign embassy would spill its true contents onto the tarmac, revealing a trail of corruption that stretched from the heart of Africa to the corridors of international power. When those diamonds scattered across the asphalt like fallen stars, they exposed a theft that had been bleeding Burkina Faso's wealth for decades. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young president who had promised his people sovereignty over their own resources, would face his greatest test. In the hours that followed, loyalties would be questioned, alliances would crumble, and the true cost of freedom would be measured in blood and sacrifice. This is a story of courage, betrayal, and the unyielding spirit of a nation determined to reclaim what was stolen from them. Before we begin this incredible story, do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from. The Harmattan wind carried the scent of dust and diesel fuel across the tarmac of Thomas Sankara International Airport. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo wiped the sweat from his forehead despite the cool January night air, his nerves betraying him. At 32 years old, he had served in the Burkinabe Armed Forces for nearly a decade, but nothing had prepared him for what the coming hours would bring. The airport hummed with its usual nocturnal rhythm. Cargo handlers moved containers under the amber glow of floodlights, while security personnel patrolled the perimeter with practiced vigilance. Amadou's unit had been assigned to oversee the departure of a diplomatic convoy, a routine assignment that should have been unremarkable. "Brother, you seem troubled," said Corporal Issouf Ouedraogo, approaching with 2 cups of Bissap tea. His voice carried the melodic cadence of a man from Bobo-Dioulasso, where the sounds of balafons still echoed through the streets on festival nights. Amadou accepted the tea gratefully, the hibiscus flower drink offering warmth against the creeping cold. "Something does not sit right with me tonight, Issouf. Look at that convoy." Across the tarmac, 3 armored vehicles bearing diplomatic plates had positioned themselves near a cargo plane. Men in civilian clothes moved with military precision, loading crates marked with the emblem of a foreign embassy. Their movements were too coordinated, too rehearsed for simple bureaucratic transport. "Diplomatic immunity," Issouf shrugged. "We are not permitted to ask questions." But Amadou's instincts, honed by years fighting insurgents in the northern provinces, refused to quiet themselves. He had seen corruption take many forms during his service. He had watched foreign companies extract gold from Burkinabe soil, while villages nearby lacked clean water. He had heard Captain Traoré's speeches about sovereignty and resource nationalism, words that had ignited hope in the hearts of millions. The radio on Amadou's belt crackled to life. "All units, be advised. Presidential security detail approaching the airport. Clear the eastern perimeter." Amadou exchanged a glance with Issouf. The president arriving unannounced at this hour was unprecedented. Something was happening, something that would transform this ordinary night into a moment that would echo through history. In the presidential convoy racing toward the airport, Ibrahim Traoré sat in the back seat, his distinctive red beret resting on his knee. At 37 years old, he had already survived 3 coup attempts and countless assassination plots. His intelligence network had intercepted communications that pointed to tonight's diplomatic shipment as the culmination of a theft operation that had been draining Burkina Faso's natural wealth for years. "How certain are we?" Traoré asked his chief of intelligence, Colonel Abdoulaye Diallo. "Certain enough to act, my captain," Diallo replied. "Our source inside the embassy confirmed that the shipment contains uncut diamonds worth over $40 million. Stones that were extracted from our soil without permits, without royalties, without any benefit to our people." Traoré's jaw tightened. The geology degree he had earned at the University of Ouagadougou had taught him the value of what lay beneath Burkina Faso's earth. His years fighting in the northern provinces had shown him the price his people paid, while that wealth disappeared across borders. And they believed they could simply fly it out under diplomatic cover, Traoré said, his voice carrying the quiet intensity that had inspired soldiers to follow him into revolution. They have done it before, many times. Tonight, we end it. The convoy accelerated through the empty streets of Ouagadougou, passing the silhouette of the Grand Mosque and the modernist architecture that stood as testament to dreams of African prosperity too long deferred. In homes throughout the city, families slept, unaware that their president was about to confront the forces that had kept their nation impoverished, despite its abundant resources. The presidential convoy arrived at the airport's military entrance with controlled urgency. Soldiers snapped to attention as they recognized the lead vehicle's distinctive markings. Traoré emerged before his security detail could open the door, his boots striking the tarmac with purpose. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo watched from his position near the diplomatic convoy, his heart rate accelerating as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding. The president of Burkina Faso was striding directly toward the diplomatic vehicles, flanked by elite soldiers in full tactical gear. "Halt all operations," Traoré commanded, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of idling engines and distant jet turbines. "No aircraft departs without my authorization." A man in an expensive suit emerged from one of the diplomatic vehicles, his expression shifting from confusion to barely concealed anger. Ambassador Henri Lefebvre had served in various African postings for 23 years, always operating under the assumption that diplomatic immunity provided absolute protection. Captain Traoré, this is highly irregular," Lefebvre protested in accented English, deliberately avoiding the French language that reminded too many Burkinabés of colonial subjugation. "These are diplomatic materials protected by international convention." Traoré stopped 3 meters from the ambassador, close enough to observe the beads of sweat forming on the diplomat's brow, despite the cool night air. "I have received credible intelligence that your shipment contains stolen property belonging to the people of Burkina Faso." "Preposterous," Lefebvre sputtered. "I will lodge a formal complaint with your foreign ministry. This is a violation of every diplomatic norm. Open the crates." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Behind Traoré, soldiers moved into position, their weapons ready but not raised. The diplomatic security personnel exchanged nervous glances, calculating odds they did not like. Lieutenant Amadou found himself moving forward without conscious decision, positioning himself where he could support his president if violence erupted. Beside him, Issouf muttered a prayer under his breath. "You have no authority," Lefebvre insisted, but his voice had lost its certainty. Traoré stepped closer, and those watching could see the steel in his eyes that had made him a legend among his troops. "I have the authority of every Burkinabé child who goes hungry while foreigners extract our wealth. I have the authority of every mother who buries a son killed by insurgents we could have defeated if our resources served our people. Open the crates, or my soldiers will open them for you." The moment stretched into eternity. Cargo handlers had stopped their work, watching this confrontation between their young president and the representative of a former colonial power. In their faces, Amadou saw reflected the generations of humiliation, the decades of exploitation dressed in legal formalities. Then one of the diplomatic security officers, a young man whose conscience apparently outweighed his orders, stepped forward. "Sir," he addressed Lefebvre, "I think we should comply." The ambassador's face flushed crimson with fury, and something else, something that looked very much like fear. "You will regret this," he hissed at Traoré. "Perhaps, but my people will not." Traoré nodded to Colonel Diallo, who directed soldiers toward the crates. The first lock was cut, the metallic snap echoing across the silent tarmac like a gunshot. As the lid was lifted, the floodlights caught what lay within, Diamonds, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, glittering like frozen fire against the dark velvet that cushioned them. Uncut stones of extraordinary quality, the geological signature that Traoré recognized immediately as originating from deposits near Bungu. "Document everything," Traoré ordered, his voice steady despite the vindication of his intelligence. "And this is evidence of theft on a massive scale." Traoré raised his hand to his radio. The command that followed would reshape the landscape of African resource politics. "Initiate lockdown. No aircraft lands or departs. All diplomatic personnel are to be detained for questioning. I want every vehicle searched, every cargo manifest reviewed." The words spread through the airport like wildfire. Within minutes, barriers descended across runways. Military vehicles blocked every exit. The control tower broadcast the unprecedented order to approaching aircraft, diverting them to neighboring countries. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo found himself assigned to secure the diplomatic convoy while the investigation proceeded. As he approached the vehicles, he could hear heated arguments through the closed windows. Someone was making frantic phone calls, their voice rising in panic. "You are the lieutenant who was watching us earlier," a voice said behind him. Amadou turned to find Colonel Diallo studying him with appraising eyes. "Yes, Colonel. I noticed irregularities in their behavior." "What kind of irregularities?" "Their movements were too coordinated for civilians, and they kept checking their watches, as if working against a deadline." Diallo nodded slowly. "Captain Traoré values soldiers who observe carefully. There may be more crates, more vehicles involved in this operation. Can I count on you to help identify them?" "My life belongs to Burkina Faso," Amadou replied, meaning every word. While security personnel worked through the night, Traoré established a command post in the airport's administrative building. Reports flowed in continuously. The diamonds in the first shipment were valued at over $42 million, but evidence suggested this was merely one of many such operations. "We have found documents in the ambassador's personal effects," Colonel Diallo reported. "They reference a network of shell companies, bank accounts in 3 different countries, and shipment schedules going back 5 years. Traoré absorbed the information with grim satisfaction. 5 years of theft. Hundreds of millions of dollars that should have built schools, hospitals, roads for our people. There is more, my captain. The documents implicate several Burkinabe officials, including 2 members of the previous government." This was the part Traoré had dreaded. Rooting out foreign exploitation was politically straightforward. Prosecuting his own countrymen who had collaborated with that exploitation would tear open wounds that had never fully healed. "And prepare arrest warrants," he said finally. "No one is above the law, regardless of their position or connections." Outside, the first hints of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Workers from the nearby neighborhoods had gathered at the airport's perimeter. Word spreading through the community about the dramatic events of the night. Some held Burkinabe flags. Others simply watched in wonder as their young president took a stand that previous leaders had been too corrupt or too afraid to make. Among them was a woman named Aminata Traoré, no relation to the president, who had spent 20 years working as a cleaner at one of the foreign mining operations. She had watched diamonds and gold extracted from her homeland while her village's children walked kilometers to fetch water from contaminated wells. Finally," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, "finally, someone fights for us." Her words, though spoken quietly, captured the sentiment spreading across the nation as news of the lockdown reached radio stations and social media platforms. From Bobo Dioulasso to Fada Ngoma, from Kaya to Banfora, Burkinabe citizens awoke to the realization that their president had directly confronted the forces that had impoverished them for generations. By mid-morning, the full scope of the operation began to emerge. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo had not slept, sustained by countless cups of tea and the electric energy of participating in something historic. He had helped search 14 vehicles and identified 3 more shipments containing stolen minerals. "This one is different," he reported to Colonel Diallo, indicating a diplomatic pouch recovered from a courier. "The weight does not match the declared contents. Papers should not be this heavy." Diallo's experienced hands opened the pouch carefully, revealing not documents but gold bars stamped with the markings of a supposedly legitimate refining company. "You have good instincts, Lieutenant. Write your observations in the official report." The investigation had grown to involve dozens of military personnel, customs officials, and investigators from the newly formed anti-corruption unit. Each discovery led to further questions. How had such extensive theft operated undetected for so long? Who in the Burkinabe government had facilitated it? And most troublingly, how many other diplomatic missions were involved in similar operations? In a makeshift interrogation room, Ambassador Lefebvre sat across from investigators, his earlier arrogance replaced by careful calculation. "I want immunity in exchange for my testimony," he stated flatly. "I can give you names, dates, bank account numbers, the entire network." Traoré observed through a one-way mirror, weighing the offer. Granting immunity to a man who had orchestrated massive theft was distasteful, but the information could expose corruption at levels that would otherwise remain hidden. "What names can you give us?" the lead investigator asked. "Ministers, generals, businessmen who present themselves as patriots while selling their country to the highest bidder." "I have documentation on all of them." The ambassador's willingness to betray his co-conspirators revealed the true nature of such networks. There was no loyalty among thieves, only temporary alliances of convenience. When those alliances became liabilities, they were abandoned without hesitation. Outside the airport, the crowd had grown to thousands. Some had traveled from distant villages, compelled by the historic nature of what was occurring. Local vendors had set up impromptu food stalls, feeding the gathered masses while they waited for news. A group of university students had organized a demonstration supporting the president's actions. They carried signs demanding justice for decades of exploitation, their chants echoing across the tarmac where soldiers maintained the lockdown. "No more stolen futures," they shouted in Moor, the language of the Mossi people. "Nor our resources for our children." Among the students was Rasmane Ouedraogo, a 23-year-old geology student who had been inspired to pursue his studies by hearing about President Traoré's own background in the field. "This is what we have been waiting for," he told a radio journalist who had made her way to the demonstration. "Be a leader who values our resources as much as we do." The journalist, named Clarisse Compaoré, had covered Burkinabe politics for 15 years. She had seen hope rise and fall with different governments, watched promises of reform dissolve into the same patterns of corruption, but something felt different this time. "What makes you believe this time will be different?" she asked Rasmane. The young man's eyes blazed with conviction. "Because Captain Traoré is one of us. He fought in the same dirt where these minerals are extracted. He knows their value not in dollars, but in schools and hospitals and opportunities for people like my family." The documents recovered from the diplomatic shipment painted a picture of systematic plunder that exceeded even the investigators' darkest suspicions. Shell companies registered in offshore jurisdictions, falsified export permits signed by Burkinabe officials, bank transfers routed through a maze of intermediaries designed to obscure their origins. Traoré reviewed the evidence in his command post, each page adding weight to the burden he carried. The theft had been facilitated not by foreign powers alone, but by his own countrymen who had chosen personal enrichment over national development. "General Bassirou Compaoré," he read aloud, the name familiar to anyone who followed Burkinabe military politics. A chief of logistics during the previous administration. According to these documents, he personally signed off on shipments worth over $70 million. Colonel Diallo nodded grimly. He is currently in the capital, attending what he believes is a routine military conference. We can have him in custody within the hour. Make it happen, but quietly. I do not want to give his allies time to destroy evidence or flee the country. The arrest of General Traoré sent shockwaves through the military establishment. Other names on the list began to panic, some attempting to flee, others destroying documents, a few reaching out through intermediaries to offer cooperation in exchange for leniency. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo had been assigned to interview the lower-level operatives involved in the scheme. These were not the masterminds, but the workers, the drivers and handlers and clerks who had kept the machinery of theft operating. One such worker was a man named Musa, a cargo handler who had worked at the airport for 12 years. His hands trembled as Amadou questioned him, not from guilt, but from fear of the powerful people he had served. "I knew what was in the crates," Musa admitted. "Everyone knew. But what could we do? They paid us well to stay quiet, and anyone who asked questions disappeared." "Disappeared how?" Musa's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was a man 2 years ago who tried to report what he had seen. They found him in the bush outside Traoré. The official report said bandits, but we all knew the truth. This darker dimension of the conspiracy, the violence used to maintain silence, had not been evident from the documents alone. People had died to protect this theft operation, murdered by their own countrymen at the behest of foreign interests." Amadou reported his findings to Colonel Diallo, who brought them immediately to Traoré. The president's expression shifted from determination to something approaching grief. "What kind of people murder their own brothers for money?" Traoré asked, though he knew the question had no satisfying answer. He had seen the same moral emptiness in the eyes of insurgent leaders who claimed to fight for Islam while profiting from human trafficking. "People who have lost their connection to our ancestors," Diallo replied, "who see only personal gain, never the community they betray." Traoré stood and walked to the window overlooking the tarmac, where the lockdown continued and the crowd had grown even larger. "We will honor those who died trying to expose this truth. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten." On the second day of the lockdown, international pressure began to mount. Foreign governments demanded the release of their diplomatic personnel. Financial markets reacted to news of the investigation with concern about stability in the region. Media outlets around the world carried images of the dramatic confrontation between the young African leader and established powers. In the presidential palace, Traoré met with his closest advisors to assess the situation. The political calculus was complex. Burkina Faso depended on international partnerships for security cooperation, development assistance, and trade relationships. Pushing too hard could isolate the nation precisely when it faced existential threats from insurgent groups in the north. "The foreign minister of France has requested an urgent call," reported Traoré as chief of staff. "And they are demanding the immediate release of Ambassador Lefebvre and threatening economic consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "Suspension of aid programs, review of trade agreements, possible travel restrictions on government officials." Traoré absorbed the threats with outward calm, while his mind raced through possibilities. He had built his political identity on sovereignty and independence, on the promise that Burkina Faso would no longer bow to foreign pressure. Capitulating now would destroy that image and embolden future exploitation. But standing firm could plunge his already struggling nation into economic crisis, giving ammunition to those who would overthrow him and return to the old ways. "Arrange the call," he decided, "but also contact our friends in the alliance of Sahel states. If we must face pressure, we will not face it alone." The call with the French foreign minister was tense but productive. Traoré presented evidence of the theft operation with clinical precision, making clear that this was not an arbitrary assertion of power, but a legitimate response to criminal activity. The foreign minister, confronted with documented proof of his embassy's involvement, shifted from demands to negotiations. We propose a joint investigation, the minister offered finally. French and Burkinabe officials working together to determine the full extent of what occurred. The investigation will be led by Burkina Faso, Traoré replied. You may send observers, but our sovereignty over this matter is not negotiable. After the call ended, Traoré allowed himself a moment of relief. The immediate crisis had been navigated, but he knew the real challenges lay ahead. Prosecuting the conspirators, reforming the systems that had enabled the theft, and maintaining national unity while confronting uncomfortable truths about complicity within his own government. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo, who had not left the airport since the lockdown began, received word that his efforts had been noticed at the highest levels. Colonel Diallo found him as he finally prepared to get a few hours of sleep. The President wishes to commend you personally, Diallo informed him. Your observations helped break this case open. Amadou felt his exhaustion transform into something approaching awe. He had served his country as a soldier, fought in battles against insurgents, but this felt different. This was a battle for the soul of Burkina Faso, a fight against enemies who wore suits instead of uniforms. I only did my duty, he replied, and that duty will be rewarded. Captain Traoré remembers those who serve with integrity. If you are enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content. The arrests came in waves over the following days. General Traoré was taken into custody without incident, his military career ending in handcuffs rather than the ceremonial retirement he had anticipated. 2 former ministers were detained at the border while attempting to flee to a neighboring country. A prominent businessman who had served as an intermediary was found hiding in a warehouse he owned on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Each arrest brought new evidence, new names, new dimensions to a conspiracy that seemed to have no boundaries. The investigation had expanded to involve forensic accountants, international legal experts, and specialist units trained in tracking financial crimes. For the ordinary citizens of Burkina Faso, the arrests represented something unprecedented. They watched on television as men who had lived like kings, protected by wealth and political connections, were treated like the criminals they were. The message was unmistakable. No one was above the law in Captain Traoré's Burkina Faso. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo had been promoted to the investigation team, his observational skills proving invaluable in piecing together the network's operations. He spent long hours reviewing financial records, interviewing witnesses, and mapping connections between the various participants in the theft scheme. One interview particularly affected him. A woman named Fatimata had worked as a secretary for the foreign mining company that had been the ultimate beneficiary of the stolen minerals. She had witnessed meetings, typed correspondence, and processed payments for years without understanding the full picture of what she was enabling. I needed the job, Fatimata explained through tears. My husband died, and I had 3 children to feed. They paid well and asked only that I never discuss what I heard in those meetings. What did you hear? Amadou asked gently. Fatimata described conversations about alternative extraction methods and diplomatic channels and partnership arrangements that now clearly referred to the theft operation. She named executives who had visited from Europe and America, detailed negotiations about prices and quantities, and recalled celebrations when particularly large shipments successfully left the country. Did you ever consider reporting what you knew? Amadou asked. To whom? Fatimata replied with bitter resignation. The police worked for them. The courts worked for them. The government worked for them. Where was I supposed to turn? A question haunted Amadou long after the interview ended. The theft operation had succeeded for so long because it had corrupted the very institutions meant to prevent such crimes. Rebuilding trust in those institutions would take years, perhaps decades, but it had to start somewhere, and perhaps it started with moments like this, with ordinary citizens finally given the opportunity to tell their truths without fear of retaliation. Traoré himself addressed the nation in a televised speech from the Grand Hall of the Presidential Palace. His words were broadcast not just domestically, but across the African continent, where leaders and citizens alike watched with intense interest. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying the weight of history, "what we have uncovered at our airport is not merely theft. It is a symptom of a system designed to keep Africa perpetually impoverished, while enriching those who exploit our resources and corrupt our leaders." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the millions watching. "For too long, we accepted this system as inevitable. We told ourselves that this was simply how things worked, that small nations like ours had no power against larger forces. But I tell you today, that era is over. Burkina Faso will determine its own destiny. Our resources will serve our people, and those who believed they could steal from us with impunity will face the consequences of their actions." The conspirators did not surrender quietly. Within days of the arrests beginning, coordinated attacks struck several locations across the capital. A bomb damaged the offices of the anti-corruption unit. Gunmen attempted to assassinate Colonel Diallo, killing 2 of his bodyguards before being neutralized. Anonymous threats flooded social media, warning of chaos if the investigation continued. Traoré responded by declaring a state of emergency, deploying additional security throughout Ouagadougou and other major cities. The lockdown at the airport, initially focused on preventing evidence destruction, became a broader security operation. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo was among those assigned to protective detail for key witnesses. He spent nights stationed outside safe houses where former employees of the mining companies waited to testify, his weapon ready for threats that could come at any moment. "How long can they keep fighting?" Issouf asked during one of their shared watches. His friend had been assigned to the same unit, their partnership continuing even as circumstances grew more dangerous. "As long as they have resources," Amadou replied. "These people have been stealing for decades. They have money hidden around the world, mercenaries they can hire, allies in other governments who benefit from their operations. So we may never fully win." Amadou considered the question seriously before responding. "Perhaps not in the way wars are won. But each person we bring to justice, each dollar we recover, each system we reform, makes our country a little more free. That is the victory we fight for." The philosophical conversation was interrupted by movement in the shadows beyond their position. Both men raised their weapons, hearts pounding as they scanned for threats. A figure emerged slowly, hands raised. "Do not shoot," a woman's voice called. "I have information. I want to help." The woman identified herself as Mariama, formerly a personal assistant to one of the arrested businessmen. She had fled when she learned her employer planned to have her silenced permanently, carrying documents that proved connections between the theft operation and insurgent groups in the north. "They were selling weapons to the terrorists," Mariama explained, once she had been brought to safety and verified as genuine. "The same insurgents killing our soldiers were being armed by the same people stealing our resources. It was never about ideology. It was always about money." This revelation transformed the investigation once again. The theft operation was not merely criminal but treasonous, directly enabling the violence that had killed thousands of Burkinabe citizens and displaced millions more. When Traoré learned of this connection, his determination hardened into something approaching cold fury. He had lost friends to insurgent attacks, had personally led operations against groups that were now revealed to have been armed by his own countrymen. "We will pursue every thread of this conspiracy," he declared to his inner circle, "regardless of where it leads, regardless of who it implicates, regardless of the political costs." These people have the blood of our soldiers and civilians on their hands. The investigation's scope expanded beyond Burkina Faso's borders as evidence mounted of international complicity. Bank accounts in Switzerland held proceeds from mineral theft. Logistics companies in Belgium had transported stolen goods. Law firms in London had structured the shell companies that obscured ownership. Traoré found himself navigating complex international diplomacy while simultaneously managing the domestic investigation. He traveled to the United Nations to present evidence and demand cooperation from member states. He met with leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States to coordinate responses to the cross-border dimensions of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo had been promoted again, this time to lead a special unit focused on recovering assets held abroad. His journey took him from Ouagadougou to Geneva, where he worked with Swiss authorities to freeze accounts connected to the theft operation. "This is remarkable work," a Swiss prosecutor named Martin told him during a late-night strategy session. "We have been trying to trace these funds for years. Your investigation provided the key we needed." "The key was always there," Amadou replied. "It just required someone with the courage to use it." The Swiss cooperation represented a broader shift in international attitudes. Initially skeptical of Traoré's claims, foreign governments were confronted with evidence too compelling to ignore. The documentation recovered from the airport shipment, combined with testimony from cooperating witnesses, painted a picture of systematic exploitation that challenged comfortable narratives about foreign investment in Africa. Media coverage evolved from skeptical to supportive. Investigative journalists uncovered additional examples of similar theft operations in other African countries, suggesting that what had been exposed in Burkina Faso was merely the visible portion of a vast criminal enterprise spanning the continent. Back in Ouagadougou, the trials of the arrested conspirators began. The proceedings were televised, allowing citizens to witness justice being served. General Traoré faced charges of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming, much of it provided by co-conspirators seeking reduced sentences. His defense attorney attempted to argue that the general had been following orders, that responsibility lay with civilian leaders who had authorized the theft operations. But documents bearing Traoré's signature, combined with testimony from subordinates he had directed, demolished this claim. "I served my country for 30 years, Traoré declared in his final statement to the court. "Everything I did was for Burkina Faso." The presiding judge, a woman named Aminata Sidibé, who had spent her career fighting corruption in the judiciary, responded with controlled fury. "You served yourself, General. You served your bank accounts and your foreign masters. The soldiers who died because insurgents received weapons, you facilitated. The children who went hungry while resources were stolen. The future that was denied to generations. These are the costs of your service. Burkina Faso condemns you." Months passed. The trials concluded with convictions across all major defendants. Recovered assets began flowing back to Burkina Faso, funding projects that had long been delayed by lack of resources. A new hospital opened in Ouagadougou. Schools were built in villages that had never had them. Roads connected communities that had been isolated for generations. Lieutenant Amadou Sawadogo, now a captain himself, had become a symbol of the transformation taking place. His journey from ordinary soldier to leader of an elite investigative unit inspired young Burkinabé, who saw in him proof that merit could triumph over connections. He had married a teacher named Adama, who had been among those demonstrating outside the airport during the lockdown. Their wedding was a modest affair in his hometown, attended by family and fellow soldiers who had shared the dangers of the investigation. "You're famous now," Adama teased him on their wedding night. "People call you the captain who caught the thieves." "I only did what any honest soldier would do," Amadou replied. "The credit belongs to Captain Traoré for having the courage to act." Traoré himself had evolved as a leader. The experience of confronting the theft operation and its consequences had deepened his commitment to resource sovereignty while also teaching him the value of patient diplomacy. He had built relationships with foreign leaders who respected his integrity, even when they disagreed with his methods. The nationalization of mining assets had continued, with Sopamib taking control of additional operations under terms that ensured benefits for the Burkinabe people. Foreign companies that agreed to fair partnerships remained welcome, but the era of exploitation disguised as investment had definitively ended, yet challenges remained. The insurgency in the north continued despite the disruption of its weapons supply. Economic development, while proceeding, could not immediately overcome decades of underdevelopment. Political opposition, suppressed but not eliminated, waited for opportunities to challenge Traoré's government. "We have won a battle," Traoré told his cabinet during a strategy session, "but the war for Burkina Faso's future continues. We must remain vigilant, remain committed, remain united in our purpose." Colonel Diallo, now a general and minister of defense, nodded agreement. "The foundation we have built is solid. What matters now is building upon it, ensuring that what we have accomplished cannot be reversed by future governments." "That is why institutions matter more than individuals," Traoré replied. "I will not live forever. No leader does. But the systems we create, the laws we establish, the examples we set, these can outlive any of us." The anniversary of the airport confrontation became a national holiday, celebrated with ceremonies honoring those who had contributed to exposing and prosecuting the theft operation. Captain Amadou Sawadogo was among those recognized, receiving medals for his service and giving speeches to young soldiers about the importance of integrity. His family had grown. A daughter named Yeninga, after the legendary warrior princess whose descendant founded the Mossi kingdoms, brought joy to their home in Ouagadougou. Amadou hoped she would inherit a country far better than the one he had known as a child, where opportunities depended on connections rather than capability. Traoré's government had survived another coup attempt, this one apparently backed by foreign intelligence services, angered by the disruption of their economic interests. The attempt failed because ordinary soldiers, inspired by the example set during the airport confrontation, refused to participate. The loyalty that Traoré had built through demonstrated commitment to national interests proved stronger than any bribery or coercion. International observers noted the transformation taking place in Burkina Faso with a mixture of admiration and concern. Admiration for the genuine improvements in governance and development. Concern about the concentration of power and the restrictions on political opposition that had accompanied those improvements. Traoré addressed these concerns in interviews with foreign journalists. "Democracy is not merely the presence of elections," he argued. "It is government that serves the people. Previous governments in Burkina Faso held elections while stealing from their citizens. We have reversed that equation. Perhaps one day we will have both genuine service and genuine elections, but the service must come first." Whether this logic would hold over time remained to be seen. History offered examples of leaders who began as liberators and ended as tyrants, their original ideals corrupted by the exercise of power. Traoré seemed aware of this danger, frequently referencing the legacy of Thomas Sankara, whose revolutionary government had transformed Burkina Faso before being overthrown. "Sankara taught us what is possible," Traoré said during one anniversary ceremony. "But he also showed us how quickly progress can be reversed. Our task is to build something that cannot be undone, that becomes so embedded in our national character that no future leader can abandon it." The old airport, Thomas Sankara International there, was scheduled to close upon completion of the new Ouagadougou-Donsine Airport, northeast of the city. But the tarmac, where diamonds had spilled and history had changed, would be preserved as a memorial, a reminder of the night when Burkina Faso had confronted its exploiters and chosen a different path. Captain Amadou Sawadogo stood on that historic tarmac as the sun rose on the anniversary of the confrontation. Around him, veterans of the investigation gathered with their families, sharing memories of the danger and triumph they had experienced together. His daughter Yenenga, now old enough to walk on her own, tugged at his hand. "Papa, why is this place special?" Amadou knelt to look into her bright eyes, seeing in them the future he and his comrades had fought to protect. "This is where your country decided to be free, little one, where we stopped letting others take what belonged to us. And the shiny stones, the diamonds, they are being used to build schools like the one you will attend. Hospitals where sick people get better, roads that connect villages so families can visit each other." Yenenga considered this with the seriousness that children sometimes bring to adult topics. "That is good, Papa." "Yes, my heart, that is very good." President Traoré arrived for the ceremony, surrounded by security but pausing to greet the gathered veterans personally. When he reached Amadou, he placed a hand on the captain's shoulder. "And you were among the first to notice something wrong that night," Traoré said. "Your instincts helped change history. I only saw what was there to be seen, my captain. You had the courage to act on it. Courage without information is recklessness. Information without courage is merely knowledge. It takes both to make change." The ceremony proceeded with speeches, honors, and remembrances. Representatives from civil society spoke about the improvements in their communities. Students from the university presented research on the economic impact of resource sovereignty. Artists performed songs celebrating the nation's transformation. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist that had settled over the tarmac, Amadou felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a suspicious observation during a routine night shift had led to the transformation of his entire country. Not perfect transformation, certainly. Challenges remained, and always would. But the direction was clear. The momentum established, the foundation laid. He thought of all those who had contributed to this moment. The witnesses who had come forward despite fear. The investigators who had worked sleepless nights pursuing evidence, the soldiers who had refused orders to protect corrupt officials, the citizens who had gathered outside the airport and around their televisions, their support providing the political backing needed for Traoré to persist. Most of all, he thought of those who had not lived to see this day, the whistleblowers silenced by violence, the soldiers killed by insurgents armed with weapons paid for by stolen resources, the children who had died from diseases that adequate health care could have prevented. "We remember you," he whispered to their spirits. "Your sacrifices were not in vain." The ceremony ended with the national anthem, voices rising together in the morning air. The words spoke of struggle and perseverance, of ancestors, wisdom, and children's hopes. They spoke of a land called Burkina Faso, the land of upright people, finally living up to its name. As the gathering dispersed, Amadou lifted Yenenga onto his shoulders and began the walk home. The future stretched before them, uncertain but promising. Whatever challenges awaited, they would face them as their ancestors had faced countless challenges before, with courage, with community, with the unshakable conviction that their land and its people deserved nothing less than dignity and justice. The diamonds that had fallen on this tarmac had revealed a truth that extended far beyond their material value. They had shown what became possible when a leader chose principle over convenience, when a nation chose sovereignty over submission, when ordinary people chose to stand for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. That was the real treasure of Burkina Faso. Not the gold or diamonds beneath its soil, but the spirit of its people, unbroken despite centuries of exploitation, rising now to claim the future that had always been their birthright. And on a tarmac, where history had changed, a father carried his daughter toward that future, one step at a time. The new Ouagadougou-Donsine International Airport gleamed under the afternoon sun, its modern architecture a testament to what Burkina Faso could achieve when its resources served its people. Captain Amadou Sawadogo stood in the departure terminal, watching aircraft from across Africa and beyond taxi along runways that had been built with recovered assets from the theft operation. His uniform bore new insignia now. He had been promoted to lead the National Resource Protection Unit, a specialized force created to ensure that the exploitation exposed during the airport confrontation could never happen again. His team monitored mining operations, audited export manifests, and investigated any irregularities in the flow of Burkina Faso's mineral wealth. "Papa!" Yenenga ran toward him, her school uniform slightly disheveled from the excitement of her first airplane trip. Behind her came Adama, carrying their infant son Ibrahim, named in honor of the president who had transformed their nation. "Are you ready for your adventure?" Amadou asked, lifting his daughter into his arms. "I am going to see the ocean," Yenenga announced with the absolute certainty of childhood. The family was traveling to Senegal for a vacation, something that would have been unimaginable for a soldier's family just a few years earlier. But salaries had improved, opportunities had expanded, and the middle class that had been promised for decades was finally emerging. Adama smiled at her husband, the years having deepened rather than diminished the love that had brought them together during those tumultuous days. The school principal asked if you would speak to the students when we return. They are studying the anniversary, and she wants them to hear from someone who was there. "I will do it," Amadou agreed. He had become an advocate for civic education, believing that the next generation needed to understand both the exploitation that had occurred and the courage required to end it. Only through such understanding could they prevent future betrayals. As they walked toward their gate, Amadou noticed a group of young soldiers in the terminal, their eyes scanning the crowd with the vigilance he recognized from his own early career. They were part of the permanent security presence at all Burkinabe airports, a reminder that the threats had not entirely disappeared even as the nation had transformed. One of the young soldiers recognized him and snapped to attention. "Captain Sawadogo, sir." "It is an honor." Amadou returned the salute with genuine warmth. "The honor is in the service, Corporal. Never forget that." The flight to Dakar passed peacefully. Yenenga pressed against the window, watching the landscape of the Sahel give way to greener terrain. Amadou found himself reflecting on all that had changed since that night when diamonds had spilled onto the tarmac and history had shifted. President Traoré remained in power, his mandate extended by popular support that showed no signs of diminishing. Critics continued to question the concentration of authority, but even they acknowledged the tangible improvements in infrastructure, healthcare, and education. The national gold refinery processed over 150 tons annually, with revenues funding development projects across the country. SOPAM-IB had become one of Africa's most successful state mining enterprises, a model studied by other nations seeking to reclaim control of their resources. The alliance of Sahel states had strengthened, with Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger coordinating not just on security, but on economic development and resource management. The dream of African unity, so often deferred, was taking concrete form in policies and institutions that served ordinary citizens rather than foreign interests. Yet Amadou knew that vigilance remained essential. New schemes emerged constantly, attempts to circumvent the controls that had been established. Corrupt individuals still sought to exploit positions of trust. The insurgency in the north, while weakened, had not been defeated. The work of building a just nation was never truly complete. In Dakar, the family spent a week exploring the city and its beaches. Yenenga experienced the ocean for the first time, her delighted screams echoing across the sand as waves chased her feet. Amadou watched his daughter play, overwhelmed by gratitude for the future she would inherit. On their last evening, As the sun set over the Atlantic in shades of gold and crimson, Amadou sat with Adama while the children slept. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not noticed those irregularities?" Adama asked. "If you had simply looked the other way, like so many others before?" Amadou considered the question seriously. "I think someone else would have noticed eventually. The theft had become too brazen, too extensive to remain hidden forever. But perhaps it would have taken longer. Perhaps more would have been stolen, more damage done. You are too modest, my husband. You were brave when bravery mattered." "I was afraid," Amadou admitted. "Every moment of that night, I was afraid. But I remembered something my father told me before he died. He said that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear. That night, Burkina Faso was more important than my fear." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Somewhere in Ouagadougou, President Traoré was probably still working, still planning, still pushing for the transformation he had promised. Somewhere in villages across the country, children were going to sleep in homes with electricity and running water, benefits of development funded by recovered resources. Somewhere in the ministries and offices of government, honest officials were doing the unglamorous work of building institutions that would outlast any individual. The story that had begun with diamonds falling from a diplomatic shipment had become something much larger. A story of a nation reclaiming its dignity, of a generation refusing to accept the exploitation their parents had endured, of a future being built one decision, one act of courage, one honest day's work at a time. Amadou thought of the memorial that now stood on the old airport tarmac, its inscription visible to all who visited. "Here, Burkina Faso chose freedom. May we always choose it again." He intended to take Yenenga there when she was old enough to understand. He would tell her about the night the diamonds fell, about the president who ordered the lockdown, about the soldiers and investigators and witnesses who had risked everything for their country. He would tell her that the story was not finished, that each generation must write its own chapter, that the freedom won by one generation must be defended and extended by the next. But that conversation could wait. For now, there was this moment, this peace, this family together under African stars. For now, there was the simple joy of a father watching his children grow in a country that finally belonged to its people. The waves continued their eternal rhythm against the shore, as they had for millennia before, and would for millennia to come. And in that constancy, Amadou found hope. Nations rose and fell, leaders came and went, but the spirit of a people who refused to be broken, that endured, Burkina Faso endured, its people endured. And the promise of that night when diamonds fell and a young president ordered a lockdown, that promise endured too, carried forward by all who believed that Africa's wealth should serve Africa's children. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.